Welcome to the Holy Post. Donald Trump made headlines last week when he questioned Kamala Harris's racial identity. Phil, Skye, and Esau McCaulley discuss his comments and how the politics of division often causes to categorize people into a single box. Then, should Christians embrace the spiritual uses of psychedelic drugs? Also, Megan Basham's new book claims progressive power brokers have corrupted evangelical leaders with money, praise, and prestige. But many of her citations are now being called into question. Which evangelical leaders are really being seduced by money? Then former Congressman Adam Kinzinger sits down with Skye to talk about the relationship between Christianity and the Republican Party, what comes after Trump, and the outsized role of fear in our politics. Well, Phil, Skye, and Caitlin are all traveling this week, but did you know that they might soon be traveling to a city near you? This fall, we're launching the HOLYPOST Events Tour with stops in Denver, Chicago, Houston, Los Angeles, and San Diego. At each event, you'll have a chance to meet fellow HOLYPOST fans in your community and hear from at least one of the HOLYPOST hosts, along with special guests like Beth Moore in Houston and Elizabeth Newman in Denver. We are especially excited about the Chicago event because it will be a live recording of the podcast with Phil, Skye, and Caitlin. We did a smaller version of this last year, and it was so much fun that we knew we had to do it again this year, but even bigger and better. If you can only make it to one of our events this fall, this would definitely be the one we would recommend. For more information and to buy your tickets now, head on over to holypost.com/events. Okay, here is episode 629.
Hey there, welcome back to the HOLYPOST podcast. This is Phil Vischer. I am here with Skye Jitani. Hi, Skye.
Hello, Phil.
Your name on our recording software says Jazzman Skye Jitani.
I did not do that.
Why?
That
what
was
do you mean
not
you did not
me.
do that? Who did that?
I have no idea, but it was not me.
Really?
Are we sure, though?
I promise. I don't know who did.
Okay.
Like did Mike do that? Did Seth do
Okay,
that?
I don't
Somebody
know.
did that.
I don't know.
I was hacked.
We're also here with Esau McCaulley. Hi, Esau McCaulley.
Thank you for having me back again.
Yeah, well, you work here now, Esau, so it's not really...
No, so listen, I'm not on this. This isn't my podcast, though.
I know.
So this, I'm a guest here, but I work at HOLYPOST. So I can say thank you for having me on the flagship.
Sure, yeah.
I'm on a little shuttle off to the side that's going to launch from the bay in about a month.
Yeah, right. And you're prepping, you're provisioning. Is that what's happening right now? You're loading oranges and salted meat into your shuttle.
Yes, to get ready.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we look forward to your maiden voyage of the good ship Esau. Now that's a biblical name, which doesn't always have positive connotations. So this voyage, this biblical voyage, is it a good omen or a bad omen? The voyage of, we should name your craft Esau and the Esau.
So I mean,
Yes?
I hate to be the one to tell you that Esau is the one who forgives his scheming brother at the end. And so the long-term slander of the biblical character Esau probably needs to cease, especially given the fact that in the story of the prodigal son, when it says the father runs and embraces the wayward kid, the language used to describe that hug and embrace is the exact same language used to describe Esau's forgiveness of Jacob. So it's possible that one of our most famous parables, the prodigal son, is modeled after the forgiveness of Esau. So don't let big Jacob, Team Jacob, slander young Esau, who's out there doing his best to inspire the people.
I like that.
It feels like I may have struck a nerve.
Not that this is personal. Not that I've been waiting on this moment my entire life.
All I wanted to say was, it's time for the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Caitlin. Today's episode is sponsored by Sundays. This is Phil. I have a dog. You have a dog. We love our dogs, and we gotta feed them something. Fresh food with human-grade ingredients is a better way to treat our dogs than that old bag of whatever that stuff is. Sawdust and cow bones, I have no idea. But fresh pet food is expensive and inconvenient, and that's where Sundays comes in. No, not the day. The new dog food company that makes air-dried dog food from a short list of human-grade ingredients. It's healthy, with beef, chicken, and digestive aids like pumpkin and ginger. It's convenient. Unlike other fresh dog foods, it's zero prep, zero mess, and zero stress. Sundays is shelf-stable and ships right to your door. And it's affordable, costing 40% less than other healthy dog food brands because they don't waste money shipping frozen packages. We've got a special offer for our dog-loving Holy Posters. Get 35% off your first order of Sundays. Go to sundaysfordogs.com/holypost or use the code HOLYPOST at checkout. That's sundaysfordogs.com/holypost. Upgrade your pup to Sundays and feel good about the food you feed your dog. And thanks to Sundays for sponsoring this episode.
You know that I'm a skeptic. I like things to have evidence, proof, data. I like to research things before I commit to them. And that even goes for my supplements. I want to know that they're high quality. That's why for the last year I've been drinking AG1. Unlike many supplement brands, AG1 conducts relentless testing to set the standard for purity and potency. I know I can trust what's in every scoop of AG1 because it's tested for 950 contaminants and banned substances, while the industry standard typically only tests for 10. AG1's ingredients are also heavily researched for efficacy and quality, and I love that every scoop also includes prebiotics, probiotics, and digestive enzymes for gut health. So, if you want to replace your multivitamins and your digestive aids, your immune support into just one simple scoop, start with AG1. Try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3 and K2 and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first subscription at drinkag1.com/holypost. That's drinkag1.com/holypost. Go check it out, and thanks to AG1 for sponsoring this episode.
Okay, we're back. Esau, have you been anywhere interesting lately? Have you been traveling, or you been hanging out in Wheaton, downtown Wheaton?
I was in Santa Monica at this church called Vintage. They were nice enough to allow me to preach there for 2 weeks, and I was able to also spend some time on the beach. And I was like, Santa Monica is beautiful. I want to live here. And then I Googled how much it cost, then I came back.
Yeah.
But I was in Santa Monica, and then after that, I was in Seattle for 3 or 4 days. But now I'm back in Wheatonland.
Wow. Okay. Welcome back. Welcome back to Wheatland. That's actually the name of another city, Wheatland. But anyway, I just got here. I'm back in the attic in Rochester. I don't know if you can see. I'm back in the attic in Rochester. Second week in a row, attic, Rochester. We've got stories. Yes, we do. We've got stories. How about you? Esau keeps writing things for the New York Times. I was going to talk about one of the stories he wrote in the New York Times, but before I could talk about it, he'd already written another one. And then that's out. And he said, "Oh, look, I did another one. Aren't I cool?" And I said, "Yeah, that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool, Esau. I'm with you. Yeah. I'm impressed." So let's talk about the second one. Okay. Yes. How about that?
Yes.
Yes.
So you want to give you a little bit of background?
Yeah, it's called On Turning Black, and there's a picture of Kamala Harris.
Yeah. So I was about to give the background. So what happened was, at the National Association of Black Journalists, Donald Trump was invited to be interviewed. And during the interview, they asked Donald Trump, presidential candidate Donald Trump, if he would disavow the Republican Party's consistent description of Kamala Harris as a DEI candidate. Now, whatever you might think about, like, Kamala as a candidate, you could agree or disagree with her politics, but the idea that she wasn't qualified, that she was only a diversity hire, is obviously deeply offensive to people of color and women, right? And so Trump took that opportunity to, instead of saying, "No, I won't do that," he actually in the end says, "I don't know, maybe she is a DEI candidate." But instead of disavowing that, he says, "Well, until recently, Kamala only claimed her Indian heritage, but now recently she's become Black, or she started to call herself Black. And up until a few years ago, she didn't call herself Black. And so you should look into that. That was his thing." And I wrote about, first of all, that wasn't true.
Who's the you in that scenario?
I think part of it was he was attempting to say to black people that Kamala isn't authentically black or hasn't claimed her black identity. Therefore, you shouldn't vote for her. And the idea that someone who is multiracial has to choose one part of their identity or the other, I just found deeply offensive. I'm in an interracial relationship. Our kids are multiracial. And the idea that, like, when my kids sometimes call themselves black, sometimes they call themselves multiracial. And when they go back and forth, it's not that they're denying who they are. It's the idea that they're not pretending like their mother doesn't exist. Yeah. And Kamala Harris has always described herself as being black and Indian because her dad is black, Jamaican, and her mom is Indian. And this idea
that reminds me of my longtime co-host Skye, who always introduced himself as Indian until he started reading about white privilege, and then he said, "Wait a minute, this is some good stuff," and suddenly then he was white. So
is this true, Skye?
No. Let's not start false rumors here.
So Phil just pulled a Trump on you.
Yeah. That's exactly. You should look into it, Esau.
Somebody should look into that. The transformation of Skye.
Here's a true story, if I can kind of piggyback on that. When I was applying for college back in 1993, I was filling out an application, and they had that section where you were supposed to mark your ethnicity. But the application at the time said check 1. And I couldn't just check 1 because obviously I'm multi-ethnic. So I decided not to check any of them. And I ended up writing my admissions essay about what's wrong with your college admission criteria when you can only check 1 box. Yeah. And that was, 30 years ago. So it's just interesting to me that Donald Trump and some of his surrogates they're kind of stuck in that time frame where they can't get into their heads that there are a lot of us who are more than one ethnic or racial background, and that he just can't hold those two things in his head at the same time, as if Kamala Harris has to pick one and she flip-flops based on what's most convenient.
Yeah, that's Donald Trump right now.
I don't actually think he's confused. I think that it was a power play. The idea wasn't that he's developed some sophisticated philosophy of race and ethnic identity that he wants to kind of toss out before the people. It was as simple as, she's not on your team, therefore you should not vote for her. And in substance, that's even reductionistic. The idea that black people or Indians or Indian people are only concerned with ethnicity. In other words, we're going to say only because she's black, with no analysis of her politics, we're going to vote for her. And what he was trying to say is that she can only get one voting block. I think that's disrespectful to both groups because as an African American, I actually care about the policies of the people who I vote for. And I think the other thing about
you don't, do you?
I do. It's a crazy take.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'll take your word for it, Esau.
Yeah. And the other thing that I think is interesting is the idea that someone from outside of that ethnic group is trying to define someone's race or ethnicity. It evokes a troubling history of in America, right? Where historically, black people didn't get in a room and decide who was and who wasn't black. It was actually related to segregation. You had the 1-drop rule, that if you had 1 drop of black blood, you were subject to all of the Jim Crow laws. And the point of defining who was and who wasn't black was to decide the government could decide who they were and weren't going to give privileges to. And so once again, the idea that someone who has a history of saying racially insensitive stuff is then going to say, I'm going to weigh in on ethnic identity is deeply, deeply offensive and problematic.
I have not heard many Trump supporters be deeply offended by it.
That might be true. That's not that's not the corner of the internet that I hang out on.
Yeah.
But I have seen, go ahead.
I have seen, though, a lot of Trump supporters trying to run away from it.
Say it was a dumb idea. Yeah.
Yeah. They're not trying to own that remark. They recognize it was terrible. They know it did not help his campaign or certainly his outreach to people of color. So they're trying to run away from it.
So, Esau, what does this have to do with us? What does it have to do? Is there application for the church? Why did you write the piece? What's the point?
I mean, I think that, my job for the New York Times is not to always speak on behalf of the church. And so this was not a particular religious piece. It was just, as an African American and someone who has children who share multi-ethnic identity, it's the idea that this politics of division and that diversity is bad and diversity can only be exploited for political gain, I think is dangerous. And I think that the idea that different types of people can live together and flourish at the same time, and we don't have to be in competition with one another, is a statement that is true for our country. But I think it's also true for the church, that the church is stronger when it uses all the gifts of the entire body of Christ. The people from every tribe, like if God gives his Spirit without measure, if God doesn't say, I'm going to give twice as much Holy Spirit to Europe as I give to parts of Asia, then the whole church needs the whole church in order to properly discern the mind of Christ. And I do think that sometimes our suspicion of diversity in the church hinders our mission. And I think that in some ways, and this is not, I'm not saying that everybody, I will say this. One of the deep problems the Republican Party has is that they can't really talk about race without stumbling over themselves and often sounding awkward and falling into things like what Trump is saying. And I do think that the church would do well to go beyond cliches and kind of ways that you push away the conversation of ethnicity. So it's always the members of the church who say, well, no, there's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free, we're all one in Christ, as if that's all the Bible has to say about diversity. And I think the church would do well to actually think through, what does the Bible say about culture and ethnicity, and how might embracing that diversity that God has given to the body of Christ make us more effective as evangelists and people who try to embody Christ's way in the world.
Is there a way for us who are concerned both about Trump and this insensitivity on racial issues, is there a way, because we all have family and friends that, support the former president, is there a way to explain this that works, to say, do you see what he's doing and why that's not good?
Well, I think that sometimes less loaded analogies is how I try to talk to people.
Okay.
So I don't think that anybody
What was
ever
my
says,
loaded analogy?
No. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about, and you asking me, how do I talk to them?
Oh, okay.
I would just go like, I wouldn't just go
Just say,
with,
don't do it like Phil does. Do it
no,
like
I wasn't talking about Phil. I was speaking about it in general.
Okay.
So most people will say I am white, but people also say that I'm Irish.
Yeah.
Right. That's something that actually happens. Or I'm German, or I'm Scot-Irish, or I'm my family's German and French or whatever. And so the idea that people have multiple identities is actually common in Europe. I have family from these two places. And no one says, well, no, you're either German or you're Irish. And so the idea that Kamala is either Black or Indian is something that doesn't actually hold to in any other context. And so I think that the basic idea is not hard for people to grasp. I think that sometimes the enemy of any weapon in a battle is actually what we run into. Mm-hmm. And that I don't think people are actually intellectually convinced that there are no multiracial people in the world. I think that it seems rhetorically effective to attack anything about people who we despise, and helping people see that that's actually what's undergirding all of this might be a helpful way to have the conversation.
Yeah. I am Swedish and German, and I tend to downplay the German and upplay the Swedish because the Germans gave us World War II and the Swedes gave us IKEA. And I'm thinking that's a friendlier look for me to go with the IKEA.
So, Phil, you downplay the German thing, you upplay the Swedish thing. I'm Swedish, Norwegian, and Indian, which I think makes me Turkish, right? If you just geographically go halfway in between.
And you are a Turkish delight.
I am. I've eaten Turkish delight. It's not just in Narnia.
Okay.
Anyway, we have no problem dealing with this in other contexts, like Esau said. People talk about their different European heritages all the time, but when it comes to race, we get really weird about it for some reason. Mm-hmm. I mean, you remember that there was some spat on Twitter a while ago with somebody who was accusing me of presenting white. They didn't know I was half Indian, and I don't know what the details were about it. And they said, well, no, Skye's white because he presents as white, therefore he's white. And I'm like, really? And it was just weird. Like, people want to categorize you as one thing and one thing only, and then you're not allowed to speak about anything outside of that identity. And that's just, I don't know why we do that with race, but we don't tend to do it with certain ethnicities.
And I will say this at the risk of being 30% too nerdy for this podcast, is that one of the things this is easy to talk about on the right and how the right does this and they can't talk about race. One of the things that like frustrates me sometimes is that people will say something like, oh, you're performing white supremacy or you're internalizing your colonialization just because I disagree with you politically or theologically. In other words, there's this idea of this is the essence of what Black people ought to believe. Even if I'm not Black, a white person will say, well, no, Esau, you've internalized your colonialization. I was like, or I just disagree on your politics. And the idea, I feel pretty free. I feel pretty liberated. And this idea that we are in this complicated place where we're trying to embrace our identities. We're trying to decolonize and rid ourselves of all of the hegemonies that society has placed upon different ethnic groups. But the idea that we can then define what that liberation looks like is often flawed, right? That I might come to, the end of my decolonialization and say, you know what, still like the creeds. Right. And because I like the creeds, I'm not performing whiteness. I just think that Christ is fully God and fully man. That the way that was articulated is fine with me. And so I do think there's a sense in which there is, in some parts of our republic, the inability to talk about race at all. And you see that with what Trump is up to. But there's also this idea that sometimes people can use racial or cultural consensuses as a box to try to force Black and brown people into. And both of those things are limiting in different ways.
Okay. I'm with you. I have a theme for this show. I had a theme last week. Last week, the theme was choices. This week, the theme is ping pong. And the reason it's ping pong is because I'm going to ping pong back and forth from stories about the conservative end of Christianity to stories about the progressive end of Christianity. Because sometimes we're criticized for, you guys always punch right. You never punch left, always punch right. So we're going to ping pong back and forth. So we start with Trump. Okay. Now we're going to go to, at a progressive Christian festival in the woods of North Carolina, psychedelics were top of mind. Psychedelics should be more deeply incorporated into Christian practice. This is the premise of this group and this meeting. On a Friday afternoon at a woodsy retreat in the middle of North Carolina, Hunt Priest, an Episcopal clergyman. Did you get that? Hunt Priest, an Episcopal clergyman. That's fantastic.
Oh, his name is Hunt Priest.
Yes.
Hunt Priest.
Yeah, so if he was a priest, he'd be priest.
Or Father Priest.
Hunt Priest. Yeah, sure. Okay. He's talking to a small group under a white tent about trying to bring together two communities that don't talk to each other. We're here to stand in the gap and bring the gap closer. You might think he's talking about what? Democrats and Republicans, conservative Christians and progressive Christians? No, he's talking about Christians coming together with the growing community of researchers that are exploring the spiritual uses of psychedelic drugs. While those researchers say that psychedelic drugs and other hallucinogenics can assist with meditation and experiencing the divine, Priest touts these substances for their reputed power to connect the mind and body with the soul as a means of healing. Okay, so here's a question. Is this something we should be looking into at the HOLYPOST? Should we assign someone on staff to start experimenting with psychedelics for purely spiritual and journalistic purposes, and would one of you like to volunteer?
I volunteer, Esau.
I declined. I've looked over my contract pretty carefully before I signed it, and I'm pretty sure that the use of psychedelics were not in my contract.
You mean your contract at Wheaton College? Because there's no stipulation about that in our contract with you, Esau.
Well, it didn't say that it didn't say that I had to. So I'm assuming in absence of a positive statement, I'm freed from the obligation to take psychedelics. I mean, I think that there is this, and I have no idea about this priest person. I do think there is this tendency sometimes in some parts of the church. I'm going to take this seriously, probably more than you want me to. Is rather than talking about our distinctions, that we always say, I'm similar to you. Or we just take what the culture is doing as a given, and then we simply expand upon it. So there's a group of people who are into psychedelic drugs. Well, I'll just take that psychedelic drugs and baptize it in some Christian gobbledygook, and then I can go forward. And I think there's important times in the culture where we need to say, you know what? We probably just shouldn't do that. There are ways in which Christianity is fundamentally at odds with what might be happening in different parts of society. And so I think that as controversial as this take might be, and it might get me canceled online for this, I am anti-psychedelic drugs in the context of Christian worship.
Oh, you didn't even, you haven't researched it. You haven't tried it. You're
you're right.
Poo-pooing it.
You are correct.
Okay.
I should probably Google it, but I'm not.
United Methodist pastor Roger Woolsey believes that psychedelics are a way for mainstream faith traditions such as his to attract young people whose spirituality includes eclectic amalgams of yoga, dreamwork journals, tarot cards, and even psychedelics. So you want to get young people back into the church, right? Mushrooms.
And that's what I was talking. That's what I was talking about. Is the assumption is take what someone's already doing and say we do that here, and that betrays kind of a fundamental distrust in the goodness of our own tradition. Like there's not enough intrinsic to the Christian message and the Christian gospel that's going to compel people. So we need to just tell them they can get some of their stuff too. So if you like Jesus and mushrooms, you could have both over here.
Okay, couple things. First of all, what happened to the good old, youth group lock-in? Or, the game night?
It's way more interesting with psychedelics.
I know, what is going on? And then secondly, don't you think a lot, Joe Rogan is obviously a very, very popular voice, especially on the right and among young men, and his show is huge, everything. And he talks about psychedelics all the time. And I don't know if I'm just out of it, if I'm a square, as they used to say back in the day, or the fact that I grew up with a father who's a physician and a mother who's a nurse, but I was terrified, not just of drugs, but especially of psychedelics, because I heard so many horror stories of people whose minds just completely broke on psychedelics, and they ended up in a psychiatric ward somewhere with severe, mental conditions because of, it seems like the culture is becoming so casual about psychedelics.
Yeah.
And again, maybe I'm totally out of touch, but I didn't think these were things that you willy-nilly experiment with the way that some people do with alcohol or even marijuana.
Did your parents also tell you you'd end up in a psychiatric hospital if you kissed a girl before marriage?
No, that was definitely not a message in my home.
They have this saying, it's not a fresh one in the Black community, but are you about that life? And if you're about that life, that means you're willing to do whatever it takes and whatever is necessary. So if you don't want to fight, you say, I'm not about that life. I pull back. And I'm going to tell you, when it comes to psychedelics, I'm just not about that life. I'm just saying, if you want to call me a coward, if you want to say that if you're scared to go to church, you are right. I'm in the church on my knees praying because I don't want any of that. I only want to see stuff that's there, right? You know what I mean? I don't want to see a vision of anything. As a matter of fact, I'm good. Maybe my Pentecostal brothers and sisters are going to be mad at me. I'm good with the gentle leading of the Holy Spirit. I don't want an angel to come show up and I'm talking about off drugs. I don't want an angel to come and the angel of the Lord to come because that's terrifying in the Bible. And so this idea that I'm going to put something in my body that's going to have me not understand what is and isn't real, or I'm going to see something that isn't real, I'm good. I'm good.
Don't you think part of it is our culture, both inside and outside the church, is just so addicted to or driven by the spectacular?
Yeah.
Even within the church, we've lost this idea that God and his grace and his goodness can be encountered in the ordinary.
Yeah.
It has to be spectacular. It has to be amazing. It has to be miraculous in order to really count. And so it's not a big step from that to go, oh, well, maybe I can enhance that with a drug or with, and we do that even in our worship and gatherings. We're this would be better if there were lasers and smoke. Because that would enhance it more. Because the ordinary just doesn't cut it for me.
I do think that the idea that we were going to actually have a kind of mechanical atheistic society on the other side of Christianity has been proven false. And I do think that there is this search for transcendence or meaning, because society isn't actually becoming atheistic. It's become vaguely spiritual and consumeristic in its religious life. And so one of the things about these kinds of fasts that come and go is they require very little of you other than the adoption of a technique. Until the guru or the person comes and says, here's what you do, here's how you have this experience, and they're your guide. There's a sense in which you can decide how much you want to take. How many mushrooms do you want? How long do you want to go and hide in the cave waiting for the vision? And so I do think there's a certain amount of, even though it's a drug, it's an attempt to have a religious experience that we could control. And one of the things about Christianity is that it's the ceding of control. Is that our lives are committed into the hands of God, and he's going to do with it whatever he will. And we trust him that it's going to be good in the end. He's not just going to, ruin things for us.
Yeah, but what if I could make it better? Just, the experience more. Woo! More woo!
Yeah.
What if I could have Jesus and glitter?
Which is what I mean when I say I'm not about that life. I'm not.
It's kind of like
I'm inside, not outside.
It's kind of like the scene of the Transfiguration when Moses shows up and Elijah, and there's all the glory is there, and Peter and John and James are like, oh yeah, we got to build some houses here. We got to build some tents. We're going to make this the permanent reality that we get to experience all the time. And whether it's psychedelic drugs or it's hopping from one massive worship experience to the next, the bigger, better mountaintop experience, we're addicted to that, and we aren't really helping to train people in how to commune with God 24/7 in the ordinariness of life and relationships in the world, and recognize, we always want the burning bush experience, and we forget that what we're called to is to have new vision, to recognize every bush is burning. God's presence is everywhere, and we can encounter him in all kinds of ordinary and unexpected ways. It's not just the spectacular. And I just don't hear that message and see that taught much. Forget the drugs side of it, just in general within the broader evangelical movement.
Back in my preaching days, before I went into preaching retirement, maybe I'll come out retirement soon. But back in my full-time preaching days, I would say to my congregation all of the time, we sometimes want to treat God's appearances as if they're just there to comfort us. In other words, we're having a spiritual crisis. We think if God would just show up and just say, hey, I exist, and then pop off, then we'd feel better. But every single time God appears in the Bible, it's always a life-changing encounter, and he usually gives them directions that's going to get you killed. And so, it's rare that God says, hey, he says Abraham, he says to Moses, he gives people to Mary, he gives people, or any of the prophets, right? And so when God shows up, it's never simply just to say, I exist. And what we actually want is
good work, keep it up. That's what he says.
It's not existential comfort, it's mission. And so I say, in some sense, that, and this will sound weird, the space that God gives us to live, right? The fact that he's not, every time you're getting ready to sin, he just pops in and goes, I see you. He actually, in his graciousness, gives us a chance to live our lives in which we should acknowledge his presence, but it's not overwhelming to us. And sometimes God's distance is actually an act of mercy. Can you imagine if there was a physical manifestation of God following you around all day? You're like, this is getting awkward. And so I do think that we want God's presence as a comfort, but not a challenge. And I think the more we are aware of God's presence, the more we're aware of our awesome responsibilities. And you're right. So most of being a Christian is just ordinary life, being aware of God's presence in the abstract. And then sometimes in our moments in our lives, it becomes overwhelming. And every single time, and listeners should think about this, every single time you have a real deep experience of God, you just cry, right? You never, or you're joyful, you're an emotional wreck whenever you're close to the presence of God. And I think that the fact that he doesn't keep us emotionally off kilter all the time is a grace. It's almost like never mind. I'll stop.
Okay. I hear you. I hear both of you. We're going to stop the experiment. Tell tell Mike, stop the experiment, let Caitlin out of the back room where we locked her up until she took magic mushrooms and reported on her findings. We just won't do it.
That'd be a really interesting episode of Curiously Caitlin.
Yes, it would. Curiously Caitlin.
And she was talking to the kids after the song. Don't do that. We're anti that.
We're anti that. We don't do that. Although it might bring the youth back into the church. It's really something to consider. Okay, ping pong time. We started out looking to the right. And then we looked to the left and went, oh, wow, that's weird. And now we're looking back to the right. Big news in evangelicalism last week. The release of Megan Basham's new book, Expose, best-selling book, currently number 15 on Amazon for all books, not Christian books, all books in the world. It's number 15, Megan Basham's book, Daily Wire reporter. Book is called Shepherds for Sale. Shepherds for Sale. We've mentioned it once before. John MacArthur described it as, this may just be the single most important book on modern evangelicalism in recent years. Single most important book on evangelicalism in recent years. What's it about? The main question is, how deeply have leftist billionaires infiltrated America's churches? In Shepherds for Sale, Megan Basham of the Daily Wire documents how progressive power brokers, from George Soros to the founder of eBay to former members of the Obama administration, set out to change the American church, their goal to co-opt evangelicals for political purposes. She exposes the celebrity megachurch pastors who secretly encouraged other pastors to change their views on sexualities, the left-wing billionaires that targeted Christian media, universities, megachurches, and nonprofits, the revered Presbyterian theologian who backed a congregation rebelling against his own denomination. This is just a glimpse into the compromises and astroturf campaigns that Basham uncovered. Many evangelical leaders are pushing their members to whisper about sexual sins, reconsider the importance of abortion, lament the effects of climate change, and repent of perpetuating systemic racism. And in exchange for towing a left-wing line, many of those church leaders and institutions have received cash, career jumps, prestige, and praise. Basham brings the receipts and names names. Okay, so have you checked the book yet, Esau, to see how many times you show up?
I have not.
I'm in it twice. I show up twice.
Oh.
Yeah. Ed Stetzer shows up 3 times. Tim Keller shows up, I think, 70 times.
Am I in the book?
I don't know. I'd have to check the.
I don't want to know.
Gavin Ortland is featured. I'm featured in the introduction to the book.
Yeah.
And do you know what my sin is? Do you know what I did with the money I got from George Soros that compromised me?
I don't know. I've not read the book, so I couldn't tell you.
I started arguing that Christians should be more nuanced about abortion. That's the charge. And this is what a lot of people are doing, that is yielding some interesting results. They're actually checking the footnotes and say, Megan, what was your source on that? What was your source on that? So I checked the footnotes to see, Megan, what was your source on me arguing for Christians to be more nuanced? And the source was Skye's abortion video. Skye's abortion video.
I'm in the book.
So I had Gavin Ortland, actually 2 days after the book came out, put out a YouTube video disputing her treatment of him in the book in significant detail. Several other people have already, this is all in the last 72 hours, put out videos attacking Gavin Ortland's explanation of his defense of his portrayal.
We got to talk. I haven't read the book yet, but I have talked to some people who, like you, Phil, are mentioned in the book and are upset about it and explain what's going on here. I think what's on my mind is I just earlier this week was going over the final edits for my next book, which comes out next year. And part of those final edits are a lot of questions about some of the sources I cite and the quotes I use. And the editor has gotten back to me and has said things like, I think this is the wrong page number for this citation for this quote, or you're quoting someone who's quoting from another source. Can you get to the original source? Like, there's a lot of drilling down into the details to make sure that the citations are accurate and the things I'm quoting or citing are being cited faithfully and accurately. And this is not like an academic book. This is just a book with doodles in it.
HarperCollins apparently did not do that.
Exactly. And that's my kind of my anger in all this is I don't know Megan Basham, but based on her online presence, I'm not surprised that she's accusing all these people of all kinds of nefarious things. What upsets me is there are people in the publisher and in the editorial realm of her publisher who know better. And they let this get through, even though so many of these sources are inaccurate or misquoted or misrepresented, they let it go through. And my hunch is because if they didn't, they wouldn't have a book and they wouldn't have revenue from this book, because anyone who has integrity would never have let this go through the way it is based on just 3 people I've now talked to who are represented in the book and totally misquoted or misrepresented. And I'm shocked that a publisher would let her get away with this.
So once again, I'm going to be clear that I can't comment on a book that I haven't read. I will say something about what publishers can and can't do. A publisher is probably not responsible for someone's interpretation of a quotation. And so if there is a source, like I could make it, if I'm writing a book and I cite something and I make what it was a wrong inference from that citation, as long as I cite them, then there's going to be not a big issue. And so the question is like, did she cite things and is she interpreted it differently? I don't think it's the editor's job. In other words, I don't think you can just simply say the publisher should have told her not to draw the inferences that she did. So I think that it might be, if there's a question of how she used sources, then I think it's actually...
I agree.
I mean, in other words, if she misinterpreted Phil, then there is a video that would Phil. In other words, you can't say, "I think you misinterpreted him." Like they're gonna say, "There's a video and there's Phil," and then she has to do what she wants to do.
Yeah, but okay, 2 things. When Phil's not in the video, that's a problem.
Oh,
right.
Oh, well,
I did a very brief intro at the beginning of the video.
Yeah, but the content of the...
Yeah, I said David French wrote a piece about Roe v. Wade, and Skye turned it into a series of tweets that got a lot of feedback. So we decided to turn it into a video. Skye wrote the video. Skye's in the video. Also, the video is not about having a more nuanced position about abortion.
That's right. It's not.
The video is discussing what's the most effective way to reduce the actual number of abortions in America, and is overturning Roe the most effective way to do it. So that's, it's not a good
okay, there's that. But then
source.
I've talked to other examples, and Gavin Ortland has his response video to this, and he shows places where she selectively uses quotation marks to quote him to say something he didn't say. That is the domain of an editor, to step in and go, hey, you're not just misinterpreting what was written, you are misrepresenting this person's own words with quotation marks in very strategic places. That is absolutely the realm in which an editor should step in and go, that's just not, that's unethical. That's wrong to cite somebody this way. So I think, forget Megan Basham for a second. There are other people who are responsible for this book who have let it be sold the way it is.
The book is being heavily pushed by folks kind of in the Trump orbit, like William Wolf, Daily Wire folks like Ben Shapiro and others at the Daily Wire. So, and that's why, it's partly why I'm bringing it up, because it has kind of the full force of the Daily Wire behind it, which has just a massive platform. She's accusing World Relief of wrongdoing. She's accusing the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the SBC of wrongdoing. She described what the people in her book are doing as pimping their pulpits and engaging in the world's oldest occupation. So,
wow.
Yeah, that's how she's describing.
I do really like the alliteration, though. I'll give her that.
Pimping their pulpits. That could be a new show on MTV. It's Pimp Your
Pimp
Pulpit.
My pulpit.
Okay, so here's what I wanted to say, because there is this movement we'll talk about this more in the future, but there's the old right, which is the Mitt Romneys and the Reagans and those people. And then there's the new right, which is Trump and Trump-like people. And it's a very different thing. And one of the
MAGA.
One of the main focal points of the new right is the deep state. And that there are all these people in the government that are actually controlling everything. They are elites. They are against the common man. They must be outed. They must be shamed, and they must be destroyed. And what is occurring to me is that people like William Wolf and Megan Basham and others are taking that out of Trump's playbook and applying it to evangelicalism and saying there's a deep state in evangelicalism. And they'll call it Big Eva. They'll call it regime. Actually, somebody tried to coin the phrase regime evangelicals.
What about the deep church?
The deep church. Yeah, that's great. So this is really an attempt at an expose to say, we've found the swamp. We're going to drain the swamp. These are all the bad guys, and they're all on the take. They're all on the take. They're in it for the wrong reasons. Their motives are bad. They're pimping their pulpits and taking George Soros money to try to convince good middle heartland Christians to believe in things like refugee resettlement and climate change. So it's really interesting because there's almost nothing that I'm aware of in the book about theology, doctrine, ecclesiology. It is almost entirely about these evangelicals aren't towing the line on the politics of the new right. And why more people aren't pointing that out, I'm not quite sure. They're mostly just saying, hey, I was misquoted.
Right.
when in fact, the whole premise is Christians, especially white Christians, are supposed to be loyal to whatever qualifies as the Republican Party at any given moment, and are supposed to change what they preach and change what they promote to match that. And if they don't, they have bad motives and they've been bought by the left.
So she's not making the argument that these people have abandoned the gospel. She's making the argument that they have abandoned conservative cultural and political values, and therefore they're not faithful Christians.
No, she doesn't even say that. She just says they need to be outed and exposed for abandoning conservative values, because the whole book starts out with the story of the Communist Party trying to infiltrate the church in the 40s, 50s, I don't know when. And, there's some declassified documents that actually show the American Communist Party was trying to have influence on pastors. And so that's the whole premise, is that it's happening again. Leftists are trying to infiltrate the church. So it fundamentally, the Communist Party infiltrating the church had nothing to do with, communists want to change our doctrine about the Trinity, or communists don't like our soteriology. It was communists want to turn us communist, and they're trying to get the church to help. So it really is a book about leftist politics, and trying to make sure that Christians reject all of them blanket, climate change, COVID, everything, reject it all. And anyone that doesn't needs to be shamed, in the same way, think McCarthy and the Anti-American Activities Commission. That's really what it is. It's an Anti-American Activities Commission where the activities are anything that isn't, right of who? I don't know. Anything that isn't right enough for the Daily Wire to approve of it is basically what it is. Esau.
I think that there's a truth that I think that Megan, as best as I can understand from what I see on social media, is this idea that some of the political statements that are made are motivated by either acceptance or some financial gain by the people who hold those positions. And I think that's a really hard thing to judge, is to look at someone from the outside and understand what internally motivates them. That almost takes an almost divine level omniscience. And so I think that what we have to be able to do, and so in some cases, and this is the part that I want to make sure it's really clear, I want to say this as clear as I possibly can. It would be simply dishonest if we didn't pretend that we didn't know what the internet wants us to say about everything politically and culturally. The internet, the social media leans left. And so if you are a Christian and you say things that are left-leaning, there is a benefit. But we also know there is a huge crowd of people who are going to support you and retweet you and fund you if you say stuff on the right. And the idea that neither one of us, those of us who have more left-leaning or right-leaning political ideas, the idea that the wider culture has no influence on us and we're just above it all, I think is dishonest. And so I think that in the same way that I know when I say something that's kind of conservative, I know what's going to happen when I say something there. I feel it. Or when I say something more progressive, I know what's going to happen and I feel that too. And the idea that I have to consistently in my own life check my motivations. And I think that if we could understand that reality and be honest about it without demonizing one another, we might get towards some conversations. I don't know. I mean, I've hung out with Phil. I'm not speaking about your wardrobe, but you don't seem like you've gotten billions of dollars, tons of money from $1 billion organization. No shade to you, nice house, whatever. You still haven't invited me over for dinner. But anyways, it doesn't seem like you're getting that. It doesn't seem like you're getting big money. And so I don't think that it's as simple as the people who do these things are strictly motivated by money. But I also don't think that we can ignore the reality of cultural pressure on the right and on the left. For example, a book that, if you look at any kind of bestseller list, when a book comes out, a super strong right-leaning book that says the left is horrible always does really well, even if it shoots up to the top. In the same way, a super progressive book that says the right is evil, it shoots to the top. What actually doesn't sell is someone who tries to be a little bit, not just nuanced, not nuance is a cheat code, but the idea that we don't take the whole thing and we try to take each issue as they come. That's actually the thing that's going to get you yelled at the most. The fact that you don't automatically repeat the talking points of one side or the other is actually the people who get lost in the sauce.
Thank you. That is exactly the point I was going to make. I think it's very problematic if you are completely in lockstep with the left and the progressive agenda, or you're completely in lockstep with the right and the right's agenda. If you can't identify where you don't fit in, then something, it's not a guarantee, but it's a pretty good sign that there might be something idolatrous going on here. And I will defend myself and the Holy Post on numerous fronts of where we do not conform to the left's agenda and we don't conform to the MAGA agenda. I would love to hear from someone like Megan Basham where she fundamentally disagrees with MAGA. Because if there's a point where she thinks MAGA is wrong or the right side is not in conformity to Christian ideals, doctrine, values, whatever, I'd be very interested to hear that. I just think it's ironic that a lot of the people she's identified in the book are ones who, to Esau's point, they don't conform to either side, but they're the ones being accused of being sellouts.
Trump backpedaling from an abolitionist view of abortion has very much upset people in that world. So that's one thing they currently do not agree with MAGA about, is that abortion is settled because we sent it back to the states.
One of the things that's also
we
interesting.
We're out of time, though.
Never mind, go ahead.
We're out of time. This is fascinating. There will be more happening. People are fact checking the book, and new fact checks will be releasing over the next week that I'm aware of. So it'll be an ongoing story. It really is. The Daily Wire became famous, for example, for Matt Walsh's documentary "What Is a Woman," where he goes around asking gotcha questions of very liberal people and then recording their stupid answers and then cutting all the stupid answers together and releasing it. And and so you can make a lot of money by making the other side look stupid. So that hasn't happened as much inside the church. That may be changing with Charlie Kirk's organization targeting churches, with the Daily Wire targeting churches. Things could start getting a little bit funky on the inside, like they are currently on the outside in pure politics. So it's an interesting story to follow. I don't think I've seen neither benefit from being a leftist, nor significant significant harm from showing up in Megan Basham's church as of yet. We'll see if that changes, if people start showing up at my door with eggs. Who knows? I'll keep you posted. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Esau, for guest hosting on the show. We'll see you soon. Can't wait for your show, the Esau McCaulley Music Hour. Am I revealing the name too soon?
We weren't telling people it's going to be a musical. Thanks for ruining that.
I'm sorry. We can cut that out. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
It's all in rhyme.
Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you next week.
We're in another divisive election year, and I know that many of you feel like me, politically homeless. That's even true regarding the issue of abortion, where I've struggled with both the pro-life and pro-choice political camps. That's why for years, I've sponsored the work being done by Pro-Grace, and I recommend you check them out too. They're advancing a non-political approach to abortion that rises above the divide by demonstrating God's grace and value for both the woman and the child. Pro-Grace provides resources, curriculum, and community so that Christians have space to explore this third way. I support Pro-Grace because they navigate this complex issue by reflecting Jesus, not a political party or partisan agenda. The HOLYPOST is partnering with them because we know that HOLYPOST listeners also care about representing God well in complicated and divisive issues. So you can visit prograce.org/HOLYPOST for free resources, including an ebook, their podcast, and an upcoming conversation exclusively for the HOLYPOST community. Again, that's prograce.org/HOLYPOST. And we're grateful to Pro-Grace for sponsoring this episode.
The HOLYPOST is sponsored by the Fresh Pressed Olive Oil Club. The prophet Elisha once performed a miracle to help a widow who was in a terrible situation. She needed more olive oil. Lots of us are trying to eat healthy, and a healthy diet includes great olive oil. You need to know about TJ Robinson, a guy who makes farm-fresh, award-winning olive oil and sells it direct to you. TJ's olive oil is incredibly delicious on salads, veggies, pasta, meat, fish, you name it. As an introduction to his Fresh Pressed Olive Oil Club, TJ is willing to send you a full-size $39 bottle of one of the world's finest artisanal olive oils, fresh from the new harvest, for just $1 to help him cover shipping. And there's no commitment to buy anything now or ever. Sure, it's great if a prophet comes to your house and gives you free olive oil from heaven, but that's probably not going to happen. TJ's Fresh Pressed Olive Oil Club might be the next best thing. Get your free $39 bottle for just $1 shipping and taste the difference freshness makes. Go to getfreshholypost.com. That's getfreshholypost.com for a free bottle and pay just $1 shipping.
Our guest today is former member of the U.S. House of Representatives, Adam Kinzinger. A member of the Republican Party, Adam became known for his vocal opposition to Trump's claims of voter fraud after the 2020 election, and was one of 10 Republicans who voted to impeach Trump over the January 6 insurrection. Skye talks with Adam about how much the Republican Party has changed from 2010, when Adam first joined Congress, to now, why he decided to speak up when he did, and how fear drives almost every decision in politics. It's a fascinating interview, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. Here is Skye's interview with Adam Kinzinger.
Adam Kinzinger, welcome to the HOLYPOST.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me. It's a apropos time, that's for sure.
It is. I am delighted you're here. I've been watching you for many years. You were a congressman from Illinois, not far from where we are in Wheaton, although Sean Casten is still my representative. But I watched your career closely. I want to start with, we're very similar in age. You have been part of the GOP. I think you were first elected to Congress, in 2010?
Yeah, 2010.
So throughout my life and yours, the GOP was always sort of associated with religious voters, particularly conservative Christian voters. It was the joke that GOP went with GOD, and there was that God gap in voting. I'm curious, since you started in politics, how have you seen the Republican Party's relationship to faith change?
It's been crazy. So look, and it was a very, very hard, I still struggle with like, understanding, and this is going to sound terrible, but understanding that you can be a Christian and not a Republican. Like, I feel some guilt now that I've left the party. And that's totally insane, because as I've gotten to know God, and I've started to really understand not just what, I was told from the pulpit, but what God is really trying to tell me and what he cares about, you realize, like, what I think happened is, look, legitimate concerns with things like, gender identity, legitimate concerns a long time ago with things like abortion, that created this marriage between the GOP and evangelicals. But what's actually happened is over time, basically evangelicals, or I'll just say Christians generally, seem to have kind of sold over their agenda from one that was close to what Jesus Christ wanted, or one that they would think about, this is what a Christian in America should be like, to what is it the GOP wants and how do we engage in this culture war? So what I see now is a Republican Party that has basically co-opted the political movement of Christianity and has in essence gone away from anything it ever stood for. And it took me a while to recognize that. I mean, ever since I was in politics from day one, there were certain things we would do that would make me uncomfortable, peddling in fear, right? I mean, to raise money, you've got to send fear out to people. And boy, the Bible sure talks about fear, and not in a way like you should use it to raise money. And
Right.
So it took me a while to come to that understanding. But I think that's where we're at now, where the GOP has in essence co-opted many of the evangelicals who, have unfortunately lost what the original intent was.
We've had Tim Alberta on the show a number of times. He's written a lot about this, comes from an evangelical background himself. He was a pastor's kid, and he's documented a lot of that use of fear to try to drum up support, and frankly, just the grift that goes on in leveraging political support from evangelical believers. When you were in Congress, when did the penny sort of drop for you that like this is a you mentioned that you were uncomfortable with some of the things that were done, but when did it get to the point where you were willing to speak up about it or call out your colleagues in the way this was being done?
Trump. I mean, look, I can always say I was pretty independent in terms of my ability to see something wrong, to speak out about it. That doesn't mean like every time I saw something wrong, I spoke out. There's a difference between, okay, this thing crossed my line and this thing I can stay quiet about.
Well, you got to pick your battles. Right?
You got to pick your battles. It was Donald Trump, and it was specifically, so in 2016, I'm this weird guy that did not vote for Trump in 16 and then kind of out of a moment of weakness did in 2020, mainly because I just didn't want to deal with the repercussions I dealt with for the last 4 years. But first off, for me, it was when he came out and, Paul Manafort, and they stripped Ukraine out of the Republican convention, out of the platform. That was a big deal for me. But then the Access Hollywood tape, it's like, okay, we all have said things we regret. We all have said things in life that we definitely don't want to come out publicly. But this was a whole new level. I mean, this was sexual assault, whatever. And to watch, a number of Republicans then backed away. But then to watch, over the next week, this basically avalanche of Christians back to Donald Trump for one reason, because of the Supreme Court. I think that's when I started to realize there's a bit of a problem here. Now, I'm not going to say that's a moment that I was able then to stand on my soapbox and say Christianity and politics isn't the same. But that was the beginning of the evolution. And then, of course, throughout the 4 years of Trump, things like one that sticks out so strongly to me is retweeting, I won't even name his name, but it's easy to find, a pastor in Texas that was talking about there's going to be a civil war. And Donald Trump, as president of the United States, retweets that. And I'm like, I got to tell you, everything I've read about Jesus is like, you probably shouldn't be pushing for civil war in a country, because he was basically like, render to Caesar that which is Caesar. It's all about souls and humanity. And I think it was an evolution, but there was a point. And of course, January 6th was the final straw, or actually the election was the final straw for me.
Well, we'll get to January 6th in a little bit. But let me talk about the other side of the aisle, because you would think in this moment when there's so much hypocrisy going on the Republican side and the evangelical support of Trump, that there would be an opportunity for the Democrats to win more religious voters. You add into that the strongest base of the Democratic Party are African-American voters, who statistically are the most Orthodox Christians in this country. They read the Bible more than any other Americans. They go to church more than other Americans. Why do you think the Democratic Party has had such a difficult time winning the support of religious believers, either in your early career or even now when there seems to be an opening?
I think it's starting. Look, I have, I try to talk fairly openly about my faith. What I've seen when I talk about it is Democratic reaction to that is not what I used to think it would be. I used to think it would be like, get your religious crap out of here or whatever. And what I've realized is there actually is a bit of a kind of a strong line of accepting and even faith itself in the Democratic Party. But I think it's the same reason that it's hard for us to imagine a divorce between republicanism and evangelicalism, which is this has just been the way it's been for 40, I guess since Ronald Reagan, really, so 44 years. And I think it's going to take Democrats a while to wake up to the fact that, we can court these voters. And what I would say is it's, we've been really programmed in this country to believe that like everything is a binary choice, right? Abortion, you're either pro-life, pro-choice, you're either pro-guns or against guns. The reality is on the spectrum of every issue, there's about 100 different positions. And we've just come to believe that you've got to just mark down the line where we're at on policies, and that's what we have to belong to. And of course, the Democrats, typically for evangelical Christians like myself, their policies don't fully line up with what I believe. But the bigger depth of this is character. And even if they don't line up with what I believe on all these issues, they have character that I think far exceeds that of like Donald Trump, for instance. That they're not going to be this, they're not like a paragon of truth, but they seem to be much more committed to truth than the Republican Party is. And they're supporting democracy. They're supporting Ukraine, who's pushing back against Russian oppression of evangelicals in Crimea. And so I think that process is beginning. I don't necessarily expect that someday, Democrats are going to have a 90% vote of Christians. But I do think you're starting to see that dam break a little bit where people can understand, look, I can vote for somebody that may not have my view on abortion because, look, I don't agree with that, but here's the things I do agree with, and I just have a binary choice here.
So, okay, let's talk about the abortion thing a little bit because you mentioned that the Supreme Court was a significant factor in what got Donald Trump elected back in 2016, and the evangelicals basically brushed aside all of his offensive character and the Access Hollywood tape and all of that because he promised to appoint conservative justices to the Supreme Court and overturn Roe. And a lot of people look back at that and go, well, he kept his promise. He got 3 justices there. They overturned Roe. The irony is the number of abortions has actually gone up since Roe was overturned. And we're seeing that pro-life initiatives in state elections, in referendum, all that, they're losing even in the reddest of red states like Kentucky. So suddenly abortion becomes apparently a detriment, a losing issue for the Republicans. And in the recent Republican convention, they actually stripped all the pro-life language out of the party platform for the first time in decades. What do you think is going on with this issue? Is it still a motivator for evangelicals, or is it just the latest principle that they've thrown aside in order to follow the cult of Trump?
I think to an extent it's a motivator, but I think if you actually if you could sit down with like your average Republican evangelical and talk about what you just said, which is, okay, since the overturn of Roe, abortions have increased. Is that really what we wanted? Because, I was less concerned, and I think most people would be less concerned with the actual existence of a law versus the number of abortions that occur, right? And so, I think they still think they're motivated by the issue of abortion, but I'm not sure the Republican Party can really hold the mantle of the pro-life party anymore. Why do I say that? Yes, they're pro-life to the extent of how we used to define it, which is overturning Roe, creating laws, whatever. But, one of the things I always assumed would happen if Roe was overturned is that then the pro-life movement or the Republican Party would pivot to things like adoption. How do we make adoption easier in this country? How do we help families to grow? Things like IVF, frankly. How do we treat with compassion women that have unwanted pregnancies that are going to carry that pregnancy to term? What's the social safety net we can put there? What's the social net, not even necessarily the financial net? And what we saw instead was the party has turned to, again, it's cultural outrage, which drives, frankly, the GOP today. It's just what's the latest outrage of the day. Whether it's the Olympics and the Last Supper, which actually wasn't the Last Supper, it was some Greek feast, evidently, but nobody's willing to accept that now. It's what's that cultural outrage? And it's turned into, okay, this state says that abortion should be banned after 15 weeks. Well, now Texas decides it's got to be 6 weeks. And then some other state decides there's no abortion at all. And then somebody's got to go a little more extreme to get more media attention. So they're going to say we need to prosecute women who go to another state to seek abortion. And all you're doing is turning the next generation of people. The Gen Zers or younger, I don't even know what they're calling the next generation. You're turning them against the pro-life movement when, frankly, the young people actually were much more opposed to abortion than, Gen Xers or baby boomers. You're turning them against us because you look like you don't care. You look compassionless. It's about this outrage. So I think we've done the exact opposite, frankly, of what we intended to do from the outset.
Okay, so that kind of gets into this broader question of just what on earth is the GOP thinking?
Right.
Let's cover a little bit of recent history. Although Trump won the Electoral College in 2016, he lost the popular vote. The GOP got smacked in 2018 in the midterm elections. Trump lost in 2020 despite the big lie. The GOP got hammered again in 2022, largely because of Roe being overturned and running really extreme candidates that were very MAGA. They keep losing over and over and over again. They're trying to distance themselves from the pro-life position because they see it as a losing issue. Are they just in a death spiral? I mean, are they so delusional that they would rather lose affirming the cult of Trump rather than abandon him and some of his crazier policies in order to actually win elections again? Where do you see the GOP going?
I'm going to try not to make this a 30-minute answer, so I'll try to keep it really quick. So
we can always do a bonus segment.
Good. Well, I've come to realize that people fear more than they fear death. They fear being kicked out of their tribe. So let me say this. I think most people would jump in front of a train to save a child and give their life in that process. That's commendable. But if you ask somebody to give their career to stand up against Donald Trump or to say the truth, and it might cost you in a primary, you maybe lose your primary. We've already seen, we don't even have to use this as a theory. People are unwilling to do that because trust me, and you've been through this too, I know in your own way, but the number of texts you get from people that you thought were friends, the outrage. I just had somebody recently tell me never to contact him again because I'm the reason that Donald Trump had an assassination attempt against him. And this is a guy I've known since I was 16 years old. I mean, and that I think scares away the leaders. Right? The leaders then become, okay, all I have to do because I have to survive, I'm in a 80% red district, is I have to do whatever the Republican base wants so I can keep getting reelected and so I can have access to power. Well, in that process, the reality is there's no secret leaders, right? There's nobody sitting there on a white horse waiting for the moment to come in. It is these people. These people are the ones that define what it is the future of the GOP is. And if every one of them are scared to tell the truth, they're scared to go up against Donald Trump because every one of us that ever did was excommunicated from the party, from the cult, frankly, that it's become. We've been pushed aside and made an example. Now, all of a sudden, you have no leaders. When Donald Trump says the election was stolen in 2020, and nobody on the media side that a certain person trusts and nobody on the leadership side that a certain person trusts stands up in front of him and says, you're being lied to. Here's the truth. And the only one saying it is me and Liz Cheney, and you can push Liz Cheney and I aside pretty easily. Then you look at that and say, there is no doubt in my mind why the Republican Party is in a death spiral, because there's nobody willing to stand in front of them and tell the truth. If you'd have had, and it's a very different example, but look at Joe Biden when the Democrats basically all came out, all taking a risk and said, we have to replace Joe Biden. He's not a great candidate. Okay. And it happened. Eventually well, what happened after Access Hollywood? What happened after 2020, after January 6th? You had a few people come out, but you did not have a party by and large stand up and say, this is not who we are, and we've got to put somebody else in there and win. And when you don't have leaders, you can't expect the followers of a party to force another direction.
Okay, so here, I agree with you. I agree with you completely. And that's a great example of contrasting what happened with Joe Biden and the Democratic leadership and what did not happen with Donald Trump at all those different junctures, whether it was Access Hollywood or the big lie, whatever. So here's my theory. I agree with you. I mean, I don't, not to offend you or your colleagues in politics, I don't tend to expect politicians to have much of a spine. It's rare when they do. I'm grateful when they do, but I don't expect it.
Yep.
But I wonder if the difference was in the last month or so since that horrendous debate that Biden had and the evidence of his mental decline. It wasn't just that Democratic leaders, Nancy Pelosi, Barack Obama, Schumer, others were in closed rooms expressing their deep concerns. The more progressive media ecosystem was also out there very vocally saying, this is outrageous. We can't keep going in this direction. Everyone from Jon Stewart to Colbert to the folks on MSNBC. There were some who were hedging, but a lot of them were coming out. Van Jones at CNN, where you guys are often on stage together, they were all saying the same thing out there. But when I go back and look at Fox News and conservative radio in 2016 or in 2020, they very, very quickly circled the wagons and backed up Donald Trump. And if all the conservative media pundits are backing Trump, if Fox News and Tucker Carlson and all those guys are all backing Trump, it gets that much harder for elected officials to stand up and confront Trump the way that the Democratic leaders did. Is that part of the difference? Is it the media ecosystem?
Yeah, it is. And it's, I mean, look at, let's take January 6th again. You know, Fox News turned against Donald Trump.
Briefly.
Or no, actually, let's even go back. Let's go back to actual election night. Remember, Fox is the first that called Arizona for Biden, which, by the way, Trump is still mad about. Biden won Arizona. They actually, Steyerwalt got fired for that call, and it was right. But anyway, you look at that, and Fox News basically was telling the truth, and then all of a sudden their ratings took a hit. And Newsmax, who used to just be some online thing, now is something people actually look at for some reason as TV. And so then Fox came back. And that's what you have. It's this profit motive. It's, look, you know, Republicans, we've always been this like free market, blah, blah, blah group. Maybe there's something innate in that. But yes, and if Fox decides to tell the truth or they get sued for $800 million, and so they've got to say, it's just going to take Charlie Kirk on Twitter to say something then to all of a sudden now be more radical, and Fox has to match that. Unfortunately, over 30 or 40 years, probably since the start of like Rush Limbaugh, we as Republicans have been programmed to believe there's conspiracies against us. There's this deep state against us. And the people that are telling us there's conspiracies in deep state are the one we listen to because we believe they're the only ones telling us the truth.
And they're making a lot of money in the process.
And they're making a ton of money, of money. You know, a famous pastor, I won't say his name, that I actually used to watch because he'd always kind of talk about like what's going on in Israel and stuff. And he was there at January 6th. And he was prophesying that, you know, oh, I heard about this earthquake and it was the CIA that attacked the DOD in Germany to steal votes or whatever. And it's like he's never held accountable for the fact that it never actually happened. And today he's still on Twitter prophesying about Israel. And it's just like it's.
You should really use air quotes when you say prophesying.
Yeah, exactly. But it's just like the amount of trust that people put in these faith leaders, as they should. You know, a faith leader should be somebody you trust, but they are abusing people and taking advantage of their vulnerability instead of leading them to better places. You know, yes, when we're vulnerable, that's when we feel weak. That's actually when we're the strongest. And that's when, you know, I've been through counseling before, as I'm sure you have. That's when you can learn things about yourself. Instead, people take these moments where they're vulnerable and they put more fear into them. And it makes money, makes a ton of money.
Absolutely. You know, going back to your point that people will not sacrifice their careers for being outed in their community or in their social group. When you've created a social ecosystem that includes faith leaders, media personalities, and political leaders, and they're all reinforcing one another, it creates it's that much harder to stand up and go against the flow. And I think as much as the Democratic Party has their own weird extreme flank, there are still journalists on the left who will stand up for truth. There are still faith leaders who will say what needs to be said. And the right just seems further down the road of this monolithic ecosystem that no one's willing to break out of, which brings me back to January 6th. Mm-hmm. And you've said that it was your faith that led you to vote to impeach Donald Trump after January 6th. What gave you the ability to stand up in that ecosystem with only, was it 9 other congressmen who voted, Republican congressmen who voted to impeach Trump? Very few. What allowed you or that small group of 10 to go against the flow at that time?
So Jamie Herrera Butler is another strong Christian, and there's a guy, Jamie Winship, who we know, and he talked a lot about fear. This guy worked for the CIA. They'd drop his family in the middle of, like the Taliban, and he'd create peace, right? I mean, it's a whole long story, but one of his big things is talking about pushing back on fear. And when we were faced with this, I had spent the last 3 months from basically election day to January 6th becoming increasingly outraged at the lies. And, watching my family members, not my immediate family, thankfully, but my extended family members get radicalized, watching my friends get radicalized. So a lot of mine was, I hope it was righteous, but it was anger. And, but, like Jamie Herrera Butler and stuff, we talked about this, and it's like, are we really going to be scared of voting to impeach this guy when we know all you have to do is compare the red letters in the Bible against the behavior of this guy and against the lies and against the conspiracy? And, it doesn't matter how well somebody says or how strongly they say they're speaking on behalf of Christianity. If it violates what's said in those red letters, the red letters themselves say, ignore that person. And so for me, it was that. It was my faith. It was the fact that I wear Andreas O'Keefe on my wrist. It was a friend of mine killed in Iraq. And after I got back from Iraq and made the decision to run for Congress, I remember specifically thinking, if I'm going to take votes to send people to war, to die for their country, which is literally, now that I have a kid, I understand this is literally the ultimate sacrifice, right? I mean, there is no bigger sacrifice. Your movie ends, you're faced with eternity, and then your sacrifice helps people you don't even know. When I realized that, I said, I cannot, in good conscience, and this is in 2010, I'm saying this, if I have to take a career-ending vote, but it's the right thing for the country, I'll do it. I thought it was like going to be Social Security reform or something, right? Like I didn't think it'd be like, actual defending democracy. But those things, like my understanding that, look, there is no way God is going to say, gosh, Adam, I wish you wouldn't have voted to impeach this liar who tried to overthrow the government. And so when I went to the floor, I felt a complete and utter peace about it. I knew it was right. I had no doubts about it. I knew there was going to be pain after that, and there was pain. But I have no doubt it was the right thing. And I think, I don't know if it was at that moment God whispering in my ear to do it. I don't know if it was just what he's built in me over time. I don't know if it was that as well as, the sacrifice that people make for their country, but I had no doubt it was the right thing to do. And if every pastor in the world told me that I was wrong in doing that, and they don't, by the way, but if every one of them did, I still don't think I would doubt that vote.
Wow. Let's talk about the current race. You came out to endorse Joe Biden, obviously, when he was still in the race. How do you feel about his decision to step out, and what is your view of Vice President Harris?
So Joe Biden's decision was absolutely right. I endorsed him the day before the debate. Talk about great timing. I have no regrets about it. Like, I really don't, because even though he had a terrible debate performance, to me, I would pick a man who's generally pretty honorable over a man who knows nothing but dishonor. So he made the right decision. I mean, the polling, when you start hearing a party say, I don't believe the polls, or the only polls that matter are election day, that means you're losing. Okay. That's usually a pretty good shortcut to see how the result's going to be. And all the numbers were saying that Biden was going to get wiped out. And, right. And I believe that. Kamala, look, I intend to endorse her. I haven't yet. That's going to be a timing issue. I think she's certainly a little more liberal than Joe Biden. She seems to understand that she's got to rein some of that in. I mean, where we get her liberal stances is mainly from the fact that she ran in a primary and tried to be kind of the left-wing person. She's reined back, her position on fracking, for instance, which is good. And I think she has an opportunity to say, look, when I was a senator for California, I represented California, a much more left state. Since I've been vice president for a whole country, here's my views. Look, I think it's still going to be a tough race. I think it's probably 50-50. She may even be slightly favored to win at this moment because you still have her vice president pick. You still have the convention ahead. I wouldn't say that in normal times she would have been my greenfield pick for president, right? I still would pick George W. Bush if I could. But I think she is head and shoulders above Donald Trump. If anything, even if it's not for policy, if anything, because I think she's fairly honorable, and Donald Trump, again, is nothing but dishonor.
Okay, let's, in our final minutes, let's play out possible scenarios. Let's say, once again, Donald Trump loses popular vote and the electoral count, and there's no evidence of any chicanery that's gone on. He's fighting to stay out of jail right now. He's not just fighting to, redeem his reputation or to restore his administration. He's fighting to stay out of jail. What does this current Republican Party do if he is not reelected?
Well, look, I'd have told you 6 months, maybe a year ago, if he's not reelected, the party will vomit him out and be done with it. And I still think that's the case, which is like, we lose. We just lost a very winnable race. That's the case. Now, I'm less certain of that than I ever have been, because the level of now seeing people more than just like, okay, I'm going to support Trump because we want to win and because he's the guy. I'm seeing people more buy into what he is saying and actually internalize this. And, if JD Vance, it's kind of been a good thing he's come out so bad out of the starting gate, because if he came out very strong, he would be the heir apparent. So I guess, look, if I was a betting man, I would bet on the Republican Party may keep Trumpism because it does work in the party, but Trump is done. But I don't think I would put all of my money on that viewpoint now, because I just don't know where the party is anymore on that.
Well, I've been wondering that too, because since the assassination attempt a few weeks ago, I don't know if you've seen much of this online, but the craziness has gone to a whole new level. In this rhetoric around Messiah anointing, divine favor upon Trump.
And by the way, in the Olympics, there was a white horse, so that must be the white horse of Revelations. That's a new one.
We're planning to do an explainer video this fall about why is it that evangelicals are so drawn to conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
It's kind of be fun to put together, but it adds this sense of inevitability that, of course, God wants Donald Trump to be reelected. So if he isn't, does that bring religious fervor to a stop the steal kind of movement that we saw a little bit of in 2020? And there were certainly religious symbols going on January 6th, but it could be off the charts in January of 2025. But you think there's still a chance they could vomit out Donald Trump. Is there a chance that the Republican Party corrects its course to the point where folks like you and Liz Cheney and Mitt Romney are welcome back in, or is that ship sailed?
If I had a quantum leap machine and I could quantum leap 10 years forward, maybe. I don't think it's a near-term thing. But I do think it's possible in 5 or 10 years. If you keep losing, look, and we all have baby boomers we love, but the baby boomer generation is the one that's been very radicalized. And obviously, unfortunately, they're dying off every day. And so in 5 or 10 years, they'll have less political power in the GOP. I'm hoping the younger generation doesn't become as radicalized. So that's my hope in the long term. And ultimately, look, it's like the verse of, if nobody worships God, the rocks will cry out. Well, I kind of see that in a way when it comes to politics. If people feel unrepresented for long enough, they're going to cry out. They're going to either create a new party or they're going to take over a party or whatever. And I kind of feel like that is building at the moment right now. I think that there is a real deep desire among America for somebody to come along and heal this country and not divide us anymore. Somebody like a Barack Obama for the Democrats or a Ronald Reagan for the Republicans that can come along and paint an optimistic vision for the future of this country. It's not 2024. It may be 2028, and that can change the party. That said, I'm not gonna hold my breath on it, because the level of radicalization has been pretty amazing. And what I fear in 2025, January of 2025, would actually be the end of 24, less about another January 6th at the U.S. Capitol. What I fear is what happens if a state is controlled by Republicans and Kamala Harris wins that state. I mean, this was unthinkable, but it wasn't after 2020 when they thought about it later, is what happens if the state legislatures simply refuse to certify the results?
Right.
Do we now have January 6th is at every state capital where Kamala Harris wins? That's what I fear, is that it's not going to be against people like me anymore that can get a security detail and kind of are a faceless name on TV. It's going to be Joe Blow that lives next to you that was counting votes that now is going to be the face of these play war, cosplay, militia people. And can I also say, like, being a man is not, and as a guy that wore a uniform for the military for 22 years, Being a man was not because I put on that uniform. So when you put on a uniform and you storm the Capitol, that doesn't make you a man. What makes you a man is to defend the innocence of people. What makes you I'm getting choked up. What makes you a man is like standing to say, we're going to support Ukraine, who is defending itself against an attack by Russia. What makes you a man is to see vulnerable populations and defend them and bring hope. It's not to yell at women. It's not to be this fake tough guy. It's not to wear a uniform and storm the Capitol. And that's where Christianity, I think, has got to lead this lost generation of men in the future.
I think it's a good word to end on. Adam Kinzinger, thank you for your voice. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for being outspoken about your faith in the public square. Appreciate it very much. And you are welcome back on the Holy Post on any time. Hope to have you back.
Yeah, it was great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
The Holy Post podcast is a production of Holy Post Media, produced by Mike Strelo, editing by Seth Gorvet. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by subscribing to Holy Post Plus at holypost.com/plus. Also, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much, much more.